YouTube video, and once again we are at a Tactica Tuesday. So in this video I wanted to briefly talk about something kind of related to what I talked about last week. Last week I spoke specifically on how to deal with enemy summoning units, and I gave a few different specifics for different armies and then kind of general principles that you could use for other armies that might function in the same way. So, for example, siege weaponry was one that I talked about with the Empire or Dwarves or any other race that had those. And so in this video, I kind of wanted to give the flip side of that particular idea and talk about how to deal with your opponent's war machines, be that a Skaven with their lightning cannon, or a dwarf cannon, or an Empire cannon, or a dwarf organ gun, or any of the other kind of siege weaponry that we see on the table. And I wanted to give a few different ways that you can do it in a similar fashion to what I did last week, talking about specific armies and the units they have, but also kind of the general concepts that you can use. So we'll start once again, just like last time, with the Stormcasts. And first off, you have the Celestant Prime. And that is, once again, pretty self-explanatory. The Celestant Prime can, in essence, deep strike onto the battlefield. He's powerful. He can kill stuff really easily. He can get where you need him, in a moment's notice. He can do the whole mortal wounds the turn that he comes into play, and every turn after that with his, kind of ranged attack. It's not that hard for him to deep strike, shoot, and then charge into the same target that he shot at. So it's really not difficult for the Celestant Prime to get in and kind of surgically remove something in the turn that you need it, on the turn that he comes in. But if you don't have access to him, or for whatever reason you're not bringing him in your force, you do have the option of Judicators, Prosecutors, and the Knight Venator. They're all really good choices as well. Now the Judicators, you want to give them the regular bow, simply because of the increased range, if this is what you're intending to hunt with them. Because their movement plus shooting range, without any other kind of command effects or modifiers or anything, is 29 inches. And the Prosecutors is 30 inches. Now, clearly those, that doesn't necessarily mean the Prosecutors are better because they have that one additional inch, because it doesn't exactly come out the same, right? Like the Judicators have a greater range for their weapon but less movement range. The Prosecutors have greater movement range but less range with their weapon. So there's a bit of a trade-off, and it's, each one is better in different circumstances, but both are good for being able to quickly reach out and hit something at great distances. And both of them can do that. 29, 30 inches is a very good portion of the battlefield that you can move up and hit rather quickly to try to remove the crew or to damage the opponent's siege machine. And both of those units are pretty good at it. You can, in most comp systems, or even if you're just playing exactly by the original rules that GW's put out, it's not hard to get a hold of those kinds of models, especially the Prosecutors from the starter set. The Knight Venator is a little bit more of a risk because it is a single hero. It's easier to, for a war machine to deal with a single hero that's, around 5 wounds like that, than a larger squad of 5 or 10 or however many of the Judicators or Prosecutors that would have a far larger total pool of wounds to kind of take the hits from. But the Venator has a total of 42 inches between his flying and his bow. With his bow being at 30 inches, he does have his, he does have his tools available to him, but he is a bit more risky because, he's probably going to be a higher priority target for your opponent's siege weapons anyways. And then I want to talk about a Chaos faction this time, and most Chaos can deal with them pretty easily. They can summon, they can have, their guys like the Bloodthirsters or the Lords of Change or the Greater Unclean ones that, are pretty powerful and can deal relatively easily with siege weapons. But I want to talk about the Bloodbound specifically, since they're one of the easiest in terms of to get a hold of models for. for Age of Sigmar. And there's two units that kind of stood out to me that were the best options. The Bloodbound by themselves don't particularly have any good ways to deal with opponents' siege weapons like cannons and organ guns especially, but the two units that I felt were best suited for this, and so if you do find yourself coming up against siege weapons as a Bloodbound player, Skull Crushers on Juggernauts and Valkia, I believe, are your two best options. The Skull Crushers because they're quick comparatively, they have the greater movement, and the fact that whenever they charge into combat, they basically generate or have a chance of generating impact hits to wound before combat's even begun. So they're good because they just are giving you additional chances to, once you get in close enough, to kill that crew quickly, which is clearly what you're wanting to do. And Valkia is fast because she can fly. Her movement is good. She's pretty deadly in close combat. And then her special shield makes it more difficult for enemies to wound you. It actually affects your opponent's die roll as opposed to modifying your own, which is a pretty big deal. Clearly, again, she's a hero. It's a bit more risky to basically put her in the line of fire for your opponent's siege weaponry, because there is the risk that she could be one-shot. But in a pinch where you may not necessarily have something that's better suited to deal with the enemy siege weaponry, she is a respectable option. Next, I wanted to cover the Death faction, my faction, and they, in my opinion, have one of the easiest and most difficult times dealing with it. You have the clearly obvious choices like a Terrorgeist or a Zombie Dragon that you can resummon in if you have a caster on the field that can move quickly and hit it very, very quickly within a couple turns, and they can take a few hits because of the number of wounds that they have typically. They're very, very hard to take down, without concentrated fire from your opponent. And if you don't necessarily have those, you do have things like the Malignance War Scroll Battalion, where you can basically slingshot units very quickly across the battlefield by just setting up turn or two in advance, or the always trustworthy Zombie Horde. You can just continue to push forward because your casualties that are suffered by the enemy cannon really don't matter, and if enemies try to lock themselves in close combat against you, then you can just break away the next turn without attacking, forfeiting your attack for the turn, but just continue to march on, because what do you care that you lost a few guys and you're not going to continue to grind out that combat? You just single-mindedly, right, because they're zombies, that's appropriate, just push forward for that siege engine. And you can take the banner totems for them to regenerate guys if they do kill enemies in the close combat phase. If they've been charged by somebody else, then you have the chance of bringing in new ones. If you have any kind of summoner, they're an ideal choice, because as you summon in more units, you can merge the squads together so that their numbers are incredibly difficult to deplete and keep depleted. Now, clearly, the flip side of that is that your casters are so important to that army, and unless you're fielding an Arcane the Black or a Vampire Lord on Zombie Dragon or something that's on a big monster, then most of your guys are not necessarily super survivable. So keeping your important casters and summoners kind of hidden from your enemy's line of fire is very, very, very important for the Death faction more than anybody else. Just because they rely so heavily on those commanders to keep their army up and running. But in terms of your troops, Death cares the least for their losses, which is of course appropriate. So they are in my opinion, the most and least bothered by enemy siege weaponry. And then of course you have the other category of armies, which are like the Empire, the Skaven, the Dwarves, guys that have their own siege weaponry, and the obvious answer with that is use your siege weaponry to kill theirs. if you can. If your siege weaponry is killed by theirs quickly, without you being able to really return fire with your own, then the best option is to have fast things on the table, like knights or very, very, very large Skaven squads can do it. A Doom Wheel is not a bad option because it potentially can be quick. With the you've got to or you can use other ranged units. Basically, like with summoning units, getting there and dealing with it quickly is always going to be your best bet because it needs to be for you a high priority target because of the impact that it can have on the game if left alone, right? So that's all I really had for this one. Just remembering that units like summoners and war machines and other things that can be quite deadly, especially as the game is prolonged, that their effect upon it continues to grow, that those kinds of units need to be high priority targets. And so you need to, when building your force, from a strategic point of view, you need to plan ways to counter those and to deal with them quickly so that their effect on the game is minimalized for, to help yourself achieve victory. But until next time, that's the end of this Tactica Tuesday, and this is James, and happy gaming.